Well, I was specifically asked by the GSD what the rent paid to date had been. So I answered that question specifically. I gave the rent paid to date, which was in the region of £600,000. I said that if you divided that by the number of months when we'd been in occupation, it gave you a particular figure, but that there'd been a rent-free period. And of course, the amount of the rent is not a question that the GSD is permitted to ask under the rules of the House, because it's a public registered document. The document is publicly available, and the rules of the House, believe it or not, but these are the rules of Parliament in the United Kingdom and in Gibraltar, is that you cannot ask questions about things that are public, because one is expected in opposition to do the work that gives you the information that is public. So I must tell you, I take great umbrage at the fact that Mr. Bossino is suggesting that I have misled Parliament. That is the most heinous accusation that you can make against a member of Parliament. He is completely wrong. If he had a shred of political decency about him, he would say, well, fair enough, I accept the Chief Minister hasn't misled Parliament, but we want to have a dispute or a discussion about this issue, about whether you should rent in the private sector or not, on which we might have a legitimate policy difference. But it's very disappointing that somebody who knows me as well as Mr. Bossino knows me, and who was not in the Parliament on the day, although it was his question, but he wasn't in Parliament to ask it, might suggest that I've somehow misled Parliament, which is something I would never do.
So let's just talk about the overall figures and the benefit. You say it's a good deal for Gibraltar. I want to ask you this question. Isn't raising revenue in this way by selling off capital assets to relieve current financial pressures, isn't that just a short-term fix?
Well, we haven't said that that's what we're going to do. You've assumed that that's what we're going to do.
What, selling off the asset? Well, didn't you say that you were going to raise 10 million?
No. I said that we could potentially raise 10 million from the capital value of these assets, but this releases 10 million pounds at least of capital value for the government to be able to put these properties out to tender for somebody else to give them the tender loving care that they need, because they really need to be stripped back to the bone in some instances, or to enable the government, once people are out of these offices, to refurbish them ourselves, being able to do the work of going back to the brick, because you can't do that sort of refurbishment if you've got people in these offices. It opens up 10 million pounds of value for the government to be able to sell or refurbish, rehouse different departments, etc. This is a Rubik's Cube where the government has to keep moving pieces around.
Okay, well, you've included that £10 million value in your calculation.
Well, only because Mr. Bossino does the foolish calculation, because it has absolutely no basis in the way that you would understand how you work out value, of saying, you sold to Bassadones for 7.5 million, you're now renting from them, and over the 22-year period, the rent is 22 million, so Bassadones are going to make a return in 8 years. That's a nonsensical way of calculating this. And I said, if you adopt his approach, then you tot up the value that we get, and I include the 10 million there, and it's at least 10 million, it's potentially more, and you end up with a loss of only 2 million over the 22 years, which makes it even more attractive and valuable to the government.
Okay, but if we do stay with Mr. Bossino's method of calculation using that 10 million value, but there's no mention at all of the cost of fitting out the premises, for example. Do you have a figure for that?
Well, I do have a figure for that, to which, as you know, Bassadones have contributed. Now, there will be a shortfall of in the region of £500,000 to £1 million there, but Bassadones have contributed. In other words, Bassadones is paying 1.5 million towards the fitting out of the offices, as well as giving us a year rent-free. That's why it's a very good deal. Mr. Bossino doesn't like to look at the bits which are the elements that show that this is a very good deal. In addition to the fact that this is the lowest contracted rent that the government has. The lowest. This is not close to the lowest. This is the lowest contracted rent the government has for the most modern offices that government is going to put public sector workers in. And let me just tell you, it's all very nice during a general election campaign or during the 4 years for the GSD to pretend and say that they're on the side of public servants and civil servants. And then when the time comes to invest in the environment in which they work, to say, it's all too expensive and we wouldn't have done it. This is the government demonstrating, the GSLP Liberal government demonstrating that we are investing in the public service and in our public service workers.
Well, Chief Minister, the public departments are going to be in a mezzanine level that will be fitted out, but you will be tied to terms of the lease, such as, for example, you wouldn't be able to make certain alterations or whatever. You wouldn't have the freedom to do with the premises as you would if it was a Crown property. But I wanted to ask you, what happens when the 21-year lease is over? The government may have sold its Crown asset, and then you'll be in a situation where you will have to renegotiate
So Ross, let's be
a
very
rent.
clear. Let's be very clear. All of the things that you are describing are the things that apply in every rental agreement that the government has entered into. And it's not just been the GSLP Liberals in government that have entered into rental agreements. So every government in the history of Gibraltar that has entered into a rental agreement has entered into that rental agreement and accepted that it cannot change anything in the structure of the building. The GSD entered into a rental agreement at the ICC for the health centre and was not able to break windows, etc., other than with the consent of the landlord, which is what you have to include in your analysis, other than with the consent of the landlord. So we enter into a lease in exactly the same terms as to alterations as every other lease the GSD entered into. We enter into it for a term. At the end of that term, the government can agree to extend with the landlord, if we can agree, or we may have made other provision, either in the 10 million of properties that we have moved them out of today, or in a new building, which we might develop for the whole of the civil service, which is something that we were able to do in the context of moving out of the ICC and bringing the health centre to Europort and the building at Europort, where we ended. Let me just please make this point, because it really does drive a coach and horses through the criticism that has been made of me. We ended the worst rental agreement entered into in the history of Gibraltar, which was the most expensive ever entered into by a government of Gibraltar, which was the sale and leaseback agreement entered into by the GSD, which Mr. Borsino was supporting and stood to defend in 2011. So look, I'm not going to take lessons on how to do rental agreements or good deals from Mr. Borsino, who has not done any good deal, whose government didn't do any good deal compared to this one in the time that they had the opportunity of doing it.
I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Mr. Borsino, because he made a criticism of the deal without having seen what the alternative was. And I want to ask you that very same question, because you've put the figures before us. We've seen the figures in the lease as to what this deal involves and costs the taxpayer. But I wanted to ask you about the cost of refurbishing these properties. Presumably you've costed that.
Where possible. Because some of these properties are not capable of refurbishment to the modern standard in order to house the departments that we're housing and which are growing and need to welcome the public and need to now be accessible also. And this is the analysis that has been done by the government. And in those instances, you end up with a situation where you are literally unable to make some of these properties accessible in a modern way, as you have to if we're going to comply with our obligations to be able to host people, for example, with disabilities and with mobility issues in some of the offices which we need to cater for them for. A modern building deals with all of those issues.
Chief Minister, what would you say to those who say you're selling the family silver?
That they are completely wrong. There could not be more wrong. The government has developed more property in the time that I have been in office than we have sold off. But it's a fair criticism and a very fair question that you should ask the GSD, because they were the ones who sold off the premium assets, the post-war housing that successive governments of Gibraltar had developed, and they sold it off. And we now have the problem. The Gibraltarian taxpayer, the Gibraltarian government has the problem that we have pockets of houses that have been sold off in the post-war states. That was the sale of the family silver, which the GSD should accept is the worst potential deal that they were doing. They sold many of them. We had to honor the contracts that they entered into, and that really gutted the value of the residential housing stock of the government. That's what the GSD did. That's what the GSD need to understand. They represent and need to stop criticizing the good deals that we have done, especially this deal, which is the best rental agreement ever entered into by a government of Gibraltar, and is the cheapest contracted rent that we have, and which Mr. Borsino's firm represented Bassadone on, giving him and Mr. Azobaldi, who are now criticizing that deal, a huge conflict of interest.
Chief Minister, at £1 million, just over £1 million over 21 years, that doesn't include increases and all the other subsidiary costs. Can I just ask you, why was such a deal signed, as the GSD pointed out in their press release, a day before the general election?
Well, for a simple reason, because it had been agreed. Just like the deal for GBC's rental was signed in a way that produces a higher rent for the same period, and which is the right deal for GBC, and this was the right deal for our public servants in those departments which are moving to the Bassadone office. But what I did do was ensure that my government never entered into an agreement after the general election had been called, as the GSD did in 2011 when they increased salaries in some departments and committed themselves to do that in writing after the general election had been called, in breach of the Constitution. What I ensured was I did not breach the provisions of the Constitution, which is what Mr. Bossino should be saying I managed to do, that is to say, acted constitutionally and not unconstitutionally as the GSD did.